We're saying if you've got wealth, share it with the poor. The early disciples shared everything they had. If you've got 100 grand lying around or 50 grand lying around, you can either share it with the rich by putting it into stocks and shares, or you can share it with the poor by putting it into a house.
Come on,
You put it into the
people.
house, you leave it in the house for 5 years, and after 5 years you can take it back.
Well, hello everybody. It's Simon Gilbo back with Inspired, and it's our first podcast. Because last week we had one of my best mates, Ed Walker, interviewing me to sort of set the scene, and now we're launching into the series proper. I'm going to interview him. I've chosen him first because what he's actually doing right now is, it could even be my favourite charity in England, what he started. It's certainly one up there. I support it financially, which says a lot because I'm super tight. No, not really. But Ed is a dear friend. We go back a long way. We go back, what is it, Ed? About 20 and some years. And Ed showed up when I was out in Burundi. Fresh face. He's a few years younger than me. I'm 48. How old are you?
40, nearly 45.
Right, okay. So I was 25, you were 22, I think. And he was working for Tier Fund. And we just had epic times together. Last week, I shared a bit about getting death threats, and he whisked me off to Uganda just to get me out of the country. And so many hilarious stories. But I remember one time we were at Kasizi Hospital in southwest Uganda, and there's a waterfall there. Actually, that waterfall, they used to chuck off the pregnant out of wedlock girls to kill them down in the waterfall below. And we were told that it was by a local, it's not possible to get to the source. And so, well, to two young sort of men who were just itching for a challenge, we just took that on. So we actually took on the impossible. It wasn't that hard, to be honest, but we crawled up through this torrent, would even be too strong, but it was a decent water flow, and we were trying to get our way up to the waterfall. And at one stage, I put my hand through some gooey stuff, and to my horror, it was a mouldy cat that was caught in the undergrowth. And I pulled out my hand and went, "Oh, that's gross! It's a mouldy cat." And Ed from behind me said, "Don't be an idiot, you muppet. That's not a cat." And he put his hand right through the same mouldy cat. Rough. Superb memory. And anyway, we did make it to the source. We got to the waterfall, and actually behind the waterfall, and I'm not sure, can I say this, Ed, but it was very funny because behind the waterfall there was like a vacuum, so everything's going upwards. So excuse the puerile humour, but we did pee, and our pee blasted upwards. It was quite an impressive visual. Anyway, enough of that. Ed, it's so good to have you, buddy. I'm really excited to hear you share. And so just introduce yourself a bit. Give us a bit of a brief history. We're going to talk more about your latter chapter, but tell us a bit about the sort of earlier stages of life.
Yeah, great. Well, just say it was great to be with you on that trip. And I should say, last week you shared how you woke up in the middle of the night with a nightmare and got short shrift for me. I think I told you to shut up, roll over, and get back to sleep. So I want to formally and publicly apologise for my
Much
lack of sympathy.
appreciated. There was a lot of resentment there.
Yeah, and what I would say is I was asleep and it was the middle of the night, so just think on that as well, will you? So no, look, in my 22, I found myself in this country I hadn't heard of before called Burundi. I was working in Tier Fund's what was then called Disaster Response Team. I was sent out because I had a passport and a pulse. I couldn't speak French, but I sort of managed just about to not sink and swam, and absolutely loved it. And the year I had in Burundi was, without doubt, the most vivid, most alive year of my life. So many new experiences, such a beautiful country, so much real danger, so much poverty, such great friendships cross culturally. And I went from there and then did a year there. That year was, according to the UN, the most dangerous. Burundi was the most dangerous country in the world at that point. And to cut a long story short, I found that I really loved what was called disaster management, and I went from there to Sudan. That was probably my hardest year of the life because it was so remote. There was no other Westerners. Food had to be flown in, no email, no anything with the outside world. No phones were allowed, not even a satellite phone was allowed. So just completely cut off, and was probably the closest I ever come to breaking down was in South Sudan. Went from there to northern Kenya and the deserts, and then went to the jungles and the tropical sweaty heat of Sierra Leone, Liberia, back to South Sudan. By this stage, I'd was engaged. Rachel and I came back, got married, and then we went out to Darfur, based in Khartoum. I was sort of heading up the Tier Fund response to the Darfur program and spent 3.5 years there before coming back to the UK.
I mean, you've written a book called Reflections from the Scorched Earth, which is a brilliant book, which I'd recommend anyway to people to read. Although you've got another book out now, but 10 years of crazy stories. Is there anything before we move on that you want to share from that season?
Yeah, I mean, virtually every manifestation of war I either experience without not chemical or biological. I either experienced directly or vicariously. So bombers flying overhead, people being assassinated that we knew, staff sexually violated, staff stabbed, staff killed, grenades, whatever. And they were really difficult. And what I think that does to you is it forces you into some of the deepest questions your faith can ever ask. Where is God in all this? How can a God of love allow? Or, they're cheesy questions, but they're very, very real. And I guess what I found is my Christian conditioning had really left me wanting. I didn't have any answers from the stock of questions I'd been given when I was growing up. But the Bible has all the answers if you look for it, especially the Old Testament. It's all there. There's plenty of violence in the Bible, and that's really encouraging. It's really good news because there's plenty of violence in the world, and that, without boring you with all the verses, which I could probably still quote to you now, or many of them, that there is plenty, and it applies to this country as well, with all the sexual violence we have to deal with, all the abuse that goes on hidden silently behind doors, closed doors. The Bible is good news into every situation like that. I genuinely have experienced that.
I loved your last chapter in Reflections from the Scorched Earth because you delve and actually try to wrestle with these really difficult questions of injustice and theological, big questions on suffering. And I mean, it's hard to give good answers, but you take a good shot at it. So that was that massive chapter of your life with Tear Fund. Then you came back to England, big transition. I forget, did you already have Iona as your first child by that stage? And then what happened next with moving to Peterborough?
Yeah, Iona came along when Rachel and I were in Khartoum, and we had the. It was a real joy actually bringing her up in a completely different culture. I love that. And then, yeah, anyway, to cut a long story short, Rachel and I gave 9 months' notice, and I applied for any job I could find in UK that would have me. Ended up in this place called Peterborough. Why on earth did anyone come to Peterborough? And found myself saying, Lord, when you're over the seas, and I'm sure you'll have experienced this, you have the great privilege of uh, knowing you are in God's will, and so much of the Bible makes so much sense.
Yeah.
So my favourite verse was always Isaiah 58, which talks about sun-scorched land, which is I spent six years in Sudan. Sudan is sun-scorched. It just made perfect sense. Releasing injustice, providing the poor wanderers shelter, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, all of which was so vivid and matched, Isaiah's experience. And then you end up in this kind of windy place called Peterborough, and you don't really know what you're doing, and you're saying to God, well, how does that verse apply? Because quite frankly, I have no idea. You must need Christians in Peterborough, but I haven't seen really how or why yet. And then what happened is that I was with Iona, I was playing on a playground, and as parents understand, you do occasionally get a bit bored after the third hour or the second hour you're doing it, and just began speaking to this guy on the bench. We've all met him, we've all had the conversation, and his story is the same story to this day. You hear many, many times. He was in prison that morning. As he was leaving, he was full of hope and determination. At the point of leaving the prison gates, the prison officer said to him, "We'll see you back here in 3 months' time." At that point, any sense of, self-esteem or hope crumbled. So he'd come out of prison. He was there on the bench. He was halfway through a bottle. I'd met him at 11 o'clock, and he'd actually made a rational choice, and because he had nowhere to go and he had no one to go to. So I said, "Don't worry, I can help you." We looked around for some hostels, none would take him. I tried Norwich, none would take him there. I said, "Well, where were you before?" He said, "Well, I was in Cambridge." So I said to him, "Well, why don't you go back to Cambridge?" He said, "Well, if I go back to Cambridge, I will end up in the same old hostel, surrounded by the same old people, doing the same old things. And I know I'll end up back inside in 3 months' time, so I'm not going to go there either." So that's what I mean. He'd made a rational choice. He had, what else did he have? He had a relational poverty that was underlying his physical poverty. He had no one to go to, so he had nowhere to go. And as I left him there to his bottle, uh, I felt two feelings, I suppose. One, disempowered, but two, well, what is the point of all these churches? I can see a half a dozen within a mile of where I'm standing. What's the point of all their worship, all their Bible studies, all their hands in the air, if not one of them is giving the homeless a home in this town? And at that point, my mind went back to the verse from Isaiah 58. Isn't this the kind of worship, you can translate it as, I have chosen to loose the chains of injustice, to set the oppressed free, and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? And it was kind of like, in that moment, as I reflected on my meeting, God was answering my prayer. He was answering my question. He was saying, Ed, these are the poor wanderers. And as I did research, I found out there are thousands of these people across the country every year, released from prison with nowhere to go. And if you give an ex-offender a home at the point of release, his chances of reoffending drops by 80%. And so, really, that's where Hope into Action began. That's a charity I then came to set up. Um, but it began as I began to think about this gentleman who I met on that bench.
And you had been working, hadn't you? When you came back, you were working with YMCA. So you'd gone. I mean, you'd gone from being the head honcho of several hundred staff back to England and starting afresh. Was the YMCA? Can you trace God's hand over that chapter in terms of equipping you, and what did you learn there?
Yeah, I mean, I learned so much. It's a completely different sector. I didn't know anything about it, so I learned so much about homelessness, and particularly youth homelessness, and how the sector in this country works. But the thing I think that really struck me is what I would call the secularization of outreach. I believe God works through the YMCA, but I believe He works through the local council and many many other charities. But I also believe in the model of outreach that we should be following is the template put down by Jesus. And when Jesus did his outreach, he would do some excellent work and proclaim the good news. So he said, as he started his ministry, this is my job description, Luke 4, I have come to release the oppressed, to set the captives free, and proclaim the good news, and proclaim this is the year of the Lord's favour. And what I mean by the secularization of outreach is 50% of that was going on very well, but so many charities had lost the willingness, the desire, the ability, whatever you want to call it, to also proclaim the good news. And I got, the great paradigm people used to say to me, you don't take advantage of the vulnerable. We don't do God. This was in 2008. It was, and I felt that very strongly. Actually, I found it easier to talk about my faith under Sharia law in Khartoum with my Muslim colleagues than I did,
Mm,
working and living in Peterborough.
fascinating.
Um, and so it was really difficult. I mean, I had to kind of, I remember going into the cathedral once with a Bible. I read through the entire book of Mark and had a pad of paper. I read every miracle that I saw Jesus do, every bit of outreach. And on the left, I put those where he spoke about the kingdom of God or heaven or, some sort of spiritual matter, and those where he didn't. And I expected most of them to be he didn't. He just did good works. Actually, I found that when I added it up, 13 of the 16 miracles, he spoke about the kingdom of God in some way. So by the time I'd walked out of that cathedral, I determined that I should do the same. And in the absence of a vehicle that I can express my faith as Jesus did, I have no option but to try and start my own. There was nothing else in Peterborough for me, nor Cambridgeshire. And actually, I would argue there are now, I know more about this, but there are 3,000 housing charities in this country. Um, the vast majority, I don't know any other operating at our scale that tries to do an excellent job with our tenants um, and proclaim the good news. And the thing that sets us apart at Hope into Action is we never want to lose our spiritual edge. That doesn't mean we bang people over the head with the Bible. It doesn't mean they have to get up and, in the morning after breakfast sing three psalms. No, but we want to at the very least pray into their lives, and if they're open to faith, they know we're Christians. If they want to talk about it, we would love to share our faith with them. It's not obligatory. We'll love them irrespective of their belief systems. We take Muslims, we'll take anyone. But there is, I've done this now for 10 11 years at Hope Interaction. There is nothing so exciting uh, of when one of our tenants
Mm.
finds a faith, the transformational power, which any objective atheist would agree. When you meet these guys, the hope that comes in them, the love that comes out of them, they themselves are much more articulate than I ever could be about what it means to hope. I was in a dark place, they say, now I can see light. That's what one of them said just a few weeks ago. I understand hope now. To be a part of that is what we work so hard for. Hope into action. We love all, not just that. We love it when our tenants, get a job. We celebrated this morning. One of our tenants got a job with holidays and full time. We praise God for that. We thank God for that. In itself, that's tremendous. We're delighted by that as well.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I almost get angry at sort of listening to that. That you consider yourself, if not the only one of the only ones that is unashamed about your faith, because we do. Everyone's. I think in this country particularly, we're on the back foot, and people are almost. Romans 1:16. I am not ashamed of the gospel, and yet so many of us are sort of ashamed of the Christian aspect of our faith. So we dumb it down, also to get access to funding, and that's the same in the NGO scene. And for us in Africa, we're never going to compromise on that. It's so critical. It is the key aspect, and it's not either or. They both go together, and I love the
Mm.
way that you marry that so sort of holistically, as you said, without forcing people, and no caveats and conditions on benefiting from your services. So well done, buddy. And so, how on earth do you start this thing?
Well, I mean, a lot of thought and a lot of prayer, and it got to the point where I couldn't stop thinking about it. And it was like a burden weighing me down, and I didn't want to do this on many levels. I'd much rather just got the next job in the YMCA, become a CEO, got an extra 10 grand on my pay packet, and all that stuff that of course, was drawn to. But it was a burden on my shoulders, and I would go to bed thinking about it. I'd wake up thinking about it, and eventually I started talking to some people saying, I think I'm going mad. Please confirm that I'm just going mad. But is there any chance this is God? And everyone who I spoke to and looked up to and respected, that they all kind of said, well, it sounds like it might be, Ed. So keep pushing forward. And yeah, so on that was the kind of emotional, the spiritual level. And some people say, God called me too. I can't, and then the next day they got up and did stuff. For me it wasn't like that. I was doubts, I was fear, I was reluctant, all of those things for many months. And I was really lucky because at the same time, my aunt gave me part of an inheritance, and I had 30 grand. And so I didn't know what to do with it. And I've been praying for months, Lord, what can I do with this money for your glory? And so, to cut a long story short, Rach, my wife and I, Rach and I, we bought the first house. We persuaded at my church, which is a Baptist church in Peterborough, to partner to commit to loving and befriending the guys in the house. I walked into the prison. I met a guy who had nowhere to go on release. I met him as he came out of prison, and that's critical because if we don't meet them, you can guarantee the drug dealers are there. They're very good at
Yeah,
marketing, the drug dealers. So it's you meet them at that point. That's a critical transition of they're fragile at that point. Drove him to the house, took him to the house. Another guy who'd been a heroin addict for 8 years into the house, and the church tried to befriend them, tried to pray into their lives. And I can remember them both being in church 2 weeks later, and I had just such a spiritual buzz. And that's really how we started it. And then it's gone from that one house, that very tentative, fear-filled step. We've just opened this week, or next week, we're just opening our 90th home,
beautiful.
each one in partnership with a church. And so we have bed spaces for now 277 tenants. We've got 230 tenants tonight sleeping in houses
Oh,
run by churches. Every one of those is being prayed for. Now, that's just beautiful, isn't it?
wonderful.
And it shows. Sorry to go on, but I believe so much. I've worked in hostels. I've run large hostels. If you want to, the church can care for people better. You can work in a multi-million-pound charity, but you can't offer the social capital, the love that exists in community of church. You can't get in a transactional support worker client relationship in the same way, nor can you get the spiritual power of prayer. And I just think churches really can care for the poor as well as no better. They can care for better than anyone. But I think churches, as you say, were on the back foot. we don't have the confidence. We think, oh, look at those multi-million pound charities down the road. They're all doing really difficult stuff, and they keep talking about, chaotic, highly chaotic clients, all this stuff. That puts us off. Actually, they're human beings. They respond to love and emotions like you and I. They're your brother in humanity. Just relate to them like you would your brother. You'll be fine. I just think churches can have the confidence to really believe in the social capital they've got, and the spiritual capital they've got.
Yeah, such a challenge to us, isn't it? How many churches are there in this nation, and how many of us could, as a church, get behind this? Well, we'll come to that in a bit. Look, you quoted a few stats there. I'm guessing because of your line of work, you'll have a stack load of stats that are both awful in terms of recidivism rates and that sort of thing, but also the difference that you've made through Hope into Action. So can you share a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, every year we measure those that have been in custody, in prison, how many of them return to prison. And that's a hard stat that is measurable. Now, that could include someone who did a crime before they met us, but if they go back to prison, we measure it. And I think nationally it's something like 40% or 60, between 40 and 60% of people that come out of jail will be back inside within 1 year. For us, it's every year it's less than 10%. And then you need to compare that against other charities. How do our stats compare against other charities? And it's actually very hard to do, but I don't want to, but I'm absolutely certain that any charity in this country would be really proud of the fact that 90% of those tenants or people they care for, if 90% of the people we care for do not go back to jail, anyone in the sector knows that is a good outcome. And it should be a good outcome, because we should be good, because God's given us brains and we want to honor God with them, and God's given us power through prayer and we want to pray for people. And the other thing I would say to that is, we don't class it as failure if one of our tenants goes back to jail, because many of those, they go back to jail, we still support them and we pray for them. And when they come out again, we house them again. And we still keep going on their journey. Or maybe they've stayed out of jail longer than they ever had before. Or maybe they go into jail. I mean, this one guy went back to jail, and the first thing he did was ask to see the local vicar from his church. So we counted that as success, because he's getting wisdom and input and love from a father figure he's never had in his life before. So we were delighted. If we weren't delighted he went back to jail, that's tragic. But you know, we're able to love them and we're able to bring light into their dark world. That's really important to us as well. So even though that stat in itself stands alone, but there's so many stories behind that. They say even the 10%, we don't give up on those 10%. So 90% of ours, manage to break the, if you like, break the oppression of recidivism, of repeatedly going back into jail, in and out, in and out. But even those 10%, we still continue to work with.
And so you talked a lot about people coming in and out of prison, but that's not your only clientele, is it? What other people do you work with?
Yeah, no, we have a really broad definition of homeless. So it could be a refugee, it could be a refugee family, it could be someone who's managed to come through the trafficking system, through what's called the NRM in this country. It could be people who've been in and out of prostitution and they're really wanting to break free from that. It could be people who've been on the streets. It could be women fleeing domestic violence. We maybe they've got one or two children with them. We've got numerous houses for women, and we've got houses for young mothers with young babies. So really what happens is, so often it happens, the church said, well, we'd love to do this, but we've got a real heart for, and they've met a need, they've met a female, they've met a whoever it may be, and we're like, yeah, our model works. That it works for the refugee, and it works for the prisoner, and it works for the guy slipping on the street, and it works for the guy sofa surfing, and it works for the lady fleeing domestic violence. And here's a stat: 155 women every week in this country are turned away from female refugees. That is a terrible statistic, because at the point a female leaves her partner, that is the point she's most likely to get duffed up really badly. It's actually the point she's most likely to be murdered. So if, having made that really brave decision, she's then turned away from refuge, that she's really vulnerable now. And I just think the church should be there.
Yeah.
The church should be caring for her. And the church can do it. And if you like, what we've done is we've invented so many wheels to prevent churches having to reinvent them. And We don't care whether you partner formally with us or not. We'd say, we'll give you what we've learned and just enable you to house the homeless. That's our vision. It's not, a vision isn't for Hope into Action to be really big. It really isn't. It's for the churches to be housing the homeless as part of their worship, as normal worship.
That's right. Yeah, no, I can hear the frustration in your voice, and I totally share it because the church is on many levels, a sleeping giant with so much potential. And let's celebrate the
Mm,
churches that are doing it. So we're not saying everyone's like switched off and not engaged. There's some beautiful models that you could tell loads of stories about. But this is very close to home because even in the summer, during lockdown, we had a guy. I live in quite a sort of posh village, and I'll call him John. John pitched his tent in the on the common, a few hundred yards from our house, and
mm,
all the groups, the local Facebook groups were buzzing. Oh, who's this guy? Where's he peeing? Where's he pooing?
mm,
And I was like, look, back from Burundi, I was like so keen to get my kids involved in a non-rich, you know, uh, just engagement, if you like. So I invited him back to our house, and I know we broke the law by allowing him in, but I think there's slightly higher principles going on here, and we let him come in and shower and take a dump and too much information, but and have a couple of meals with us a week,
mm,
and so we engaged with him, and I got a taste. I mean, he was very broken. He was out of prison. He was off drugs, but needing to take whatever it is regularly to keep him on track, methadone, and it was so tricky
mm,
because it consumed my life for about 6 weeks, and
mm,
I wanted to do the right thing, but it was the neighbors weren't happy with it. Even actually, my kids didn't really buy into the process of him eating with us regularly because he just dominated. He was shout. He didn't have social graces, and I was like, I cannot do this on my own. Actually, two houses down, there's a church leader, and he joined. So we were like both doing stuff, but then he could play us off against each other, and then there's all these different
mm,
dynamics, and I felt so utterly helpless and frankly really discouraged. And yet, I've read your book, A House Built on Love. I'm a supporter of Hope into Action. I'm like, I know this can be done, and here we are. And there's church here. I'm part of this church. It's a great church, and it's like flipping heck, what? It was that sense of utter frustration, and I guess anyone who engages would share that feeling. We want to do the right thing. Loads of people listening right now, we want to do the right thing, and how do we go about it? Go on, Ed, help us out on that
mm.
one.
Yeah, it is a real challenge, and I think it's fair to say not everyone is ready to change yet, or they're not at the point on their journey where they can be helped to engage. But what we would say is, if you our belief is this: if you give someone a safe, secure home, and you're saying to them, "We believe you're worth it. Here is a really nice pad. Here's the key to it. We trust you with it, and we're going to surround you with really positive relationships." No different from what you try to do with your children, I try to do with my children. Then the outcomes is that they are more likely to make good decisions. And that's really important to sort of, the thinking behind that is, we can't change anyone's life for them. We can't make any decisions for them. All Hope Interaction with our church partners can do is create an environment where they are more likely to find hope, find motivation, and make good life choices. And the other thing to your question there is, as you say, uh, there are challenges. You need wisdom. You need actual expertise to go alongside that. And with every Hope Interaction House, as well as the church, we have what we call an empowerment worker. And we really plug into all our empowerment workers, all our training, all our policies, all our procedures. And they are, if you need a bad cop situation, they can be the bad cop. If you need to discipline them, we can discipline them through the empowerment worker, which means that then the church isn't having to discipline them. And so that combination works really well. We have the phrase, we want to be professionally excellent and spiritually passionate. And the empowerment worker carries this seam of professionalism, I don't really like the word professionalism, but hopefully seam of brilliance. We want to honor God with our
Mm.
mind through the way we think about how we approach things, like house rules, or all that. We want to make sure the house is really safe, so we're going to have the right fire equipment, all that stuff we think about. And we make sure every house, I can tell you, every house that opens with us, it's always got all the right stuff, the health and safety, it's all covered. Really boring stuff that no church leader cares about, but we care about, because we want to love this tenant, and we want to be honouring to him. So, having professional alongside the passion of the local church, I think, is a really good blend.
Yeah. Oh, excellence. Excellence in Jesus' name, isn't it? That's one of our
Mm.
values, stated values. And so, that what I love further is that this has been recognised on a national level, hasn't it? So you're not picking up Christian awards, you're getting sort of secular awards. So tell us a bit on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. We've had right wing think tanks like Ian Duncan Smith set up this Centre for Social Justice. They gave us an award. We've had NHS have given us awards. Homeless Link, which is a kind of leading think player, player in the homeless sector, they've given us an award. The one that really touched me was we got a Guardian award from the Guardian newspaper, and the reason it touched me is, when I go back to 2008, and I was talking about this kind of secularization, and in a sense, the Guardian would have embodied that, the big state approach. I've got nothing wrong. I'm not nothing wrong with the big state approach, but um, for them to recognise us, the award they gave us is the best housing project in the country,
Brilliant.
and for them to recognise that us, with the church at the heart of our model, uncompromising our faith, um, and to say no, this is the best housing project in the country. That it really was an endorsement to me that our faith can be palatable, that good news is good news, and we don't have to hush it up or quieten it up, or lie about the fact, oh, we're Christians, we don't want people to come to faith. No, we're Christians. Of course, the honest truth is, I want you to come to faith. I'm not going to lie to you about that. The key thing you should know, if you're from my local council, is I'm never going to force that on someone. But I'm not going to lie to you and cover up my real beliefs about evangelism. And you can do that, and that still can be palatable to a highly secular organisation and mindset that you would find in the Guardian. So that was a proud moment for me when we got that.
Yeah, well done. Hope into action. The whole team. I know it's a big team, isn't it? Now, you've got dozens of beautiful stories of transformation. We haven't got time for stat loads. How about one or two? Just a couple of lovely highlight vignettes.
Yeah, I mean, let's think. I'll give you different types of people. But there's a guy we moved in earlier. I'll call him Richard in the early days, and we moved into the house. And I don't know how long he'd been on heroin for, but a very long time. And to cut a long story short, we had to tell him off various times because we found all the gear in his house. But to cut a long story short, he got clean. And at one stage, someone from the council said, I never thought this would happen to Richard. I picked him up out the gutter with a needle hanging out of his arm. I can't believe how he has changed, and well done. And I was there when he got baptized as well. And that was a great moment. The other one I would talk about is a lady who Kate had to evict. She relapsed. She came from a rehab. She relapsed. She went back from that really difficult state into sort of prostitution in order to score. I can remember just after or just before we evicted her, going up and meeting her and explaining it, and she had this kind of really innocent face that belied the past and the file that she had. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Kate sort of kept in touch with her, and she is now 5 years clean. She often speaks for Hope into
Wonderful.
Action. She also often speaks to me about theology, and I'm like, right, that's really helpful.
Huh,
So this sense that actually God speaks to us through our tenants is, I think, part of what we want to be. We want to be people that listen and are expectant for God to speak to us through our tenants. Because Jesus said, when you visit the prisoner, I'm there. So therefore, we should expect to meet him in the poor, and that's what we do. That's what we strive for.
absolutely. So, and I know there's plenty more stories, but as I said, we just haven't got time for that. But I'm guessing in the mix, there's some really gut wrenching times when you want to give up as well. So tell us about the darker side, the sort of the fuller picture, if you like.
Yeah, the truth is, at Hope into Action, if I want to paint a good story, I always feel a bit of a fraud, because the truth is, almost every day and every week now, we have some amazing stories. And in the same breath, we have some really challenging, upsetting, difficult stories. So whether it's a bloke that's been beaten up this week, whether it's a situation of sexual violence that we've had to deal with this week, um, and these really affect you, because often you can really see the potential in someone. You meet someone and you've met them, and your heart goes out to them. You can see Christ in them. You see so much potential in them, and then you see them messing up. And or life just catches up with them and they make a tragic decision again, and you may be forced to evict them or discipline them, and it's really hard. And at those points, you always cycle home wanting to give up, or you cycle home screaming out to God in prayers, going, God, why have you let this happen? Come on, I can see that she wasn't born this way, or he wasn't born like a drug addict or a prostitute. It's tragedy that has happened that has meant they're in this gutter now. And why haven't you answered my prayers? And this isn't worth, that is also part of what it's like to be in Hope into Action. To encapsulate that, there was one place we work and they had two tenants, did the same team, the same house, doing the same thing. One of those had come out of a sex trafficking situation. I'm friends with her now on Facebook. She's clean. She's off her drink. She's regularly putting spiritual posts up, and it's a wonderful story. The other tenant, uh, I remember meeting her in jail, and she gave me so much hope. And she now has, unfortunately, taken her own life. And I
Tragic.
just, this is what we trade in. This is what we deal in. We showed love to both of them. We showed the love of God to both of them. We have no control over how that plays out, but we were therefore successful with both because we were able to be channels of God's love for both of them, and we hold both in our hearts. The tragedy and the triumph.
Mm,
That is our journey.
yeah, yeah. Um, as we sort of come into land, a big part of what you would love to see would be people using their wealth wisely. What would that look like in your ideal scenario?
Yeah, listen, I'm sure if we're Christians, we've all heard the sermon, and we all tithe or we give money, and I think we can be really proud of that. We're really generous people in this country in terms of giving. What happened with myself and Rach is we had this £30,000 lying around, not knowing what to do with it, and we kind of put it into a house, and the key thing there is we still own the house. We've leased it to Hope into Action. So we haven't given that money away. What we've actually done is we've shared it with the poor because the poor are now benefiting from our wealth. I did nothing to earn that. I know that's just a blessing. It's total fluke of nature that I was born into that wealth. But I'm now sharing it with the poor. The poor are benefiting. I can tell you now, I met someone this week who was on heroin when he went into their house. He's now an ex-tenant. He's 5-year clean. He goes to my church. He's a wonderful friend. He's a great guy. That's because I shared my wealth with the poor. And what I can't believe it now I think about it. So I started this on a hunch saying, if I've got 30 grand and I've only ever worked for charity, my wife's a nurse, and I don't tell anyone about this money, it's a big secret. I thought I can't be the only one. There has to be other Christians out there with wealth. And so we started on a hunch. And to cut a long story short, we have 90 homes now bought by Christians. I looked at our spreadsheet today. We have over £1 million of pledged funding, pledged investors that can be deployed to buy a house tomorrow if we want it. And so we've fallen into realizing there is this huge ceiling. When I say huge, I'm talking millions and millions wouldn't cover it. There must be billions of pounds worth of Christian wealth sat in our savings accounts, sat in our ISA accounts, and no one is speaking into this. No one's preaching into it. There is this great, I think it's a blind spot in our Christian theology.
Mm,
And what we're doing is we're coming along and say, John the Baptist said, if you've got one tunic, share one with, give one, you've got two tunics, share one with the poor. We're saying if you've got wealth, share it with the poor. The early disciples shared everything they had. When I tell my daughter to share her doll, all parties involved in that exchange understand she's going to get her doll back. If you've got 100 grand lying around or 50 grand lying around, you can either share it with the rich by putting it into stocks and shares, or you can share it with the poor by putting it into a house.
come on,
You leave it
people.
in the house for five.
Sorry,
Yeah, you
interrupting.
leave it in the house for five. No, don't worry. You put it into the house, you leave it in the house for 5 years, and after 5 years, you can take it back. Um, we have enough money as Christians. We have the financial power to buy every house, buy every homeless man or woman a house. I absolutely believe it. When Jesus fed the 5,000, he didn't say, go over there to local council and, get them to give some money. He said, what have you got? Look to yourselves. And then he transformed that to feed the 5,000. And Yeah,
Yeah.
we have the financial power.
You are preaching it, brother. Preach it, preach it. I'm like, come on, people. Let's get 10 houses out of this very podcast. Come on, don't sit on the money.
Yeah.
Share it. Let's do it. Look, time's up, buddy. Just anything we've missed, anything. I have a dream. I think of Martin Luther King's speech. What would be your dream? Is there anything else that we've missed out that you had a burning desire to share? And then we'll wrap up.
No, that's great. I mean, we see a time where 20 years ago, it wasn't normal for a church to do alpha. And 30 years ago, it wasn't normal for a church to have microphones. It now is. Both those things are part of the DNA of church, which gives us encouragement because churches are dynamic and fluid and they're open to the movement of the Holy Spirit. In 20 years' time, you walk into a church, you expect to see the alpha, you expect to find the microphones, and you expect them to have a house for the homeless and the
Yes.
vulnerable. That's what is normal. And that would be our vision. We don't care about hope into action. We're here to serve the church. We want to see the church at the center and the heart of social reform, caring for the poorest of their community in an effective, holistic, relational, spiritual, long-term way.
Oh man, I would love to listen to you loads more. But look, how can people get in touch with you? What details do you want to share?
Website, hopeintoaction.org.uk. If you're interested, the book, by all means, buy the book. If you can't afford to buy the book, we'll send you one and you can give 10 out to your church. That seems to be a really effective way to inspire people. But just get in touch. Anyway, which way, shape, or form, we'll connect with you and we'll see what God's put on your heart.
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking, someone's listening right now and they're like, okay, my life group. Let's get 10 books for them, and we'll all be on the same page. And then, as a life group, we'll get this house, and and you say you've got money already ready to do it, and then it'll be like more than a project. This is lives at stake, and we can engage.
Mm.
So, oh, bless you. Pass on blessings to all your team. I pray for them regularly, and that's it. So, folks, that's our second or first non-me podcast, and it's next week. You're in for a real treat, so please come back, listen again, subscribe to the podcast to stay up to date with the latest episodes. If you enjoyed it, I'd love it if you gave us a 5-star rating. That will get us on more people's radars. And if you want to be in touch with me, you can go to simongilbo.com. I'm on various social media platforms. All right, so God bless you all. Thanks for coming. See you next week. Toodaloo.